A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. Picture this scene. You're 12 years old, zipped snug in your sleeping bag inside a tiny tent. You're camping in the deep Quebec wilderness, miles from the nearest human being. It's the dead of night, pitch black all around, and nothing but a thin sheet of nylon stands between you and the vast, wild darkness beyond. Then you hear it, a low grunt, a snuffling sound, the metallic clatter of a pot tumbling over. Your heart starts hammering in your chest. It's a bear, a 400-pound black bear, prowling around your campsite. You can hear the heavy padding of its paws, the brush of thick fur scraping against your tent wall. You freeze, barely breathing, silently begging it to just wander away. Eventually it does, but an hour later, it's back. And another hour after that, back again. 3 times this massive, invisible creature circles your camp, drawn by the lingering aroma of dinner. Now imagine what poor little David Anderson went through when, on that third visit, the bear's claws suddenly ripped through his tent. Imagine the pure terror as the bear, driven mad by hunger, clamped its jaws into his small body and dragged him, screaming into the darkness, away from the campsite. By the time his fellow campers managed to unzip their sleeping bags and stumble after him, it was already too late. Little David Anderson was gone forever. This actually happened, and these were the exact stories that author Bill Bryson was reading, night after night, just before he decided to embark on a camping trip of his own. But this wasn't going to be any ordinary camping trip. He was going to walk the entire Appalachian Trail. Today, we're exploring Bill Bryson's masterpiece, A Walk in the Woods. This isn't just another travel book. It's a profound, hilarious, and deeply human story about what happens when someone who is, by his own cheerful admission, spectacularly out of shape, decides to tackle one of the planet's greatest wilderness challenges. It's about friendship, about confronting your own limitations, and about rediscovering the wild, forgotten beauty hiding in your own backyard. By the time we finish today's journey, you'll understand not just what it takes to walk over 2,000 miles, but why the attempt itself, even if you fail spectacularly, might just be the most important part of any great adventure. So let's hit the trail. Every great journey starts with a single step, but for Bill Bryson, it began with a path. After nearly 20 years living abroad, he moved his family to a small New Hampshire town. There, right at the edge of town, he discovered a trail that disappeared into the woods. A modest sign announced that this was the celebrated Appalachian Trail. Now, this isn't your average footpath. The Appalachian Trail, affectionately known as the AT, is the grandfather of all long-distance hikes. It stretches for more than 100 miles along the backbone of America's eastern mountains, from Georgia all the way up to Maine. It crosses 14 states, climbing up and down peaks with names that sound like poetry: the Blue Ridge, the Smokies, the Green Mountains, the Whites. For Bryson, standing there at that trailhead, the idea was intoxicating. He could, theoretically, just start walking from his new home and end up in Georgia, 800 miles away. Or he could head the other direction and hike to the legendary peak of Mount Katahdin in the deep Maine wilderness. A little voice in his head whispered temptingly, "Sounds neat. Let's do it." So he started rationalizing it would get him fit after years of what he lovingly called waddlesome sloth. It would help him reconnect with his native country. He'd learn to fend for himself in the wilderness, to stop feeling like a cupcake when other men swap stories of outdoor adventures. He wanted, as he so perfectly expressed it, the swagger that comes from being able to say, with a slow, manly sniff, "Yeah, I've shit in the woods." But there was something deeper driving him, something more urgent. The Appalachian forests, this ancient, magnificent sweep of hardwood trees, were in serious trouble. Scientists were warning that climate change could devastate them, and trees were already dying at alarming rates. If there was ever a time to witness this singular wilderness, it was now. So he committed. He announced his grand plan to friends, family, and his publisher. And then he started his research. That's when reality came knocking, hard. He quickly realized this wasn't going to be some pleasant woodland stroll. It was way beyond anything he'd ever attempted. The woods, he discovered, were absolutely teeming with danger. Not just rattlesnakes and bears, but things he couldn't have dreamed up in his worst nightmares. He read about rabies-crazed skunks, merciless fire ants, and even moose driven insane by a parasitic worm that burrows into their brains and makes them chase hikers into glacial lakes. He discovered gruesome stories of hikers who stepped out of their tents for a quick midnight pee, only to be swooped upon by a nearsighted owl that proceeded to tear off their scalp. He heard of a woman who woke to find a copperhead snake cozying up in her sleeping bag for warmth. Then there were the diseases. Lyme disease, which can trigger a whole carnival of symptoms from facial paralysis to chronic depression. And hantavirus, a little-known organism that thrives in mouse droppings. You can inhale it simply by sleeping in a rodent-infested shelter, and guess what? All the shelters are rodent-infested. Hantavirus is nearly as lethal as rabies or Ebola, and there's no treatment whatsoever. But his greatest fear, the one that kept him staring wide-eyed at his ceiling night after night, was bears. He bought a book called Bear Attacks, Their Causes and Avoidance, and read clinically detailed accounts of people being gnawed to pieces in their sleeping bags, plucked whimpering from trees, or stalked while they innocently cooled their feet in a mountain stream. He became obsessed with the nightmare scenario of lying alone in a flimsy tent, listening to a bear just outside, wondering about its intentions. His particular dread was cemented by a photograph showing 4 black bears prowling a campsite together. 4! He hadn't even considered they might travel in groups. What would he do if 4 bears invaded his camp? As he put it, he would die, obviously. Literally shit myself lifeless. All this mounting fear was compounded by another, more practical problem. The crushing loneliness. What if he fell and broke his back? What if he got lost in a blizzard? You could literally die from something as simple as a twisted ankle out there if you were alone. He desperately needed a companion. He sent out hopeful feelers to friends, but nobody responded. Then, just as his departure date loomed closer, the phone rang. It was an old-school friend named Stephen Katz. Katz was absolutely the last person Bryson expected to hear from. They'd traveled through Europe together as young men, a trip that started with them getting on each other's nerves and ended with them actively despising each other. Since then, their lives had taken wildly different paths. Katz had spent years wandering through a haze of drugs and alcohol, a journey that included having his car repossessed and spending time in a minimum security prison. But he'd since gotten clean, attending regular meetings and trying his best to straighten out his life. "This Appalachian Trail deal," Katz said slowly over the phone. "Do you think maybe I could come with you?" Bryson was absolutely thrilled. He wasn't going to have to walk alone. He didn't care one bit about Katz's checkered past or his current condition. He just desperately needed a warm body to share the trail with. "How are you with bears?" Bryson asked as his final question. Katz replied confidently, "Hey, they haven't got me yet. That was exactly the spirit." A week later, Katz stepped off a small commuter plane in New Hampshire. Bryson saw immediately that this was going to be interesting. Katz was, in his carefully chosen words, arrestingly larger than he remembered, bringing to mind Orson Welles after a very bad night. He was limping and gasping for breath after walking just 20 yards. His opening words were, "Man, I'm hungry." He then explained that he needed to eat every hour or so, preferably donuts, or he might suffer seizures. When Bryson gently pointed out the notable lack of donut shops in the wilderness, Katz beamed proudly. He'd come prepared. He gestured toward his massive Army surplus duffel bag. It weighed at least 75 pounds. "Snickers," Katz explained cheerfully. "Lots and lots of Snickers." The preparation for the trip turned into a comedy of errors. Their first stop was the outfitter's store, where a kindly but overwhelmingly thorough salesman named Dave Mengel introduced Bryson to a bewildering world of high-tech gear he never knew existed. They discussed carbon fiber stays, side compression straps, and something mysteriously called the occipital cutout ratio. Every single piece of equipment, Bryson learned with growing alarm, was shockingly expensive and seemed to require another, equally expensive companion piece. A $250 backpack didn't come with straps and wasn't even waterproof. That required a separate rain cover. Then came the food shopping adventure. Katz, taking enthusiastic charge, piled a shopping cart dangerously high with pepperoni, cans of Spam, pounds of rice, and the complete range of Little Debbie snack cakes. They ended up with far too much food, a problem that would solve itself in a rather dramatic fashion later on. Packing was an absolute nightmare. Katz, completely overwhelmed, simply lay on his bed listening to his Walkman while his gear remained scattered everywhere. The night before they left, strange noises floated through the walls, frustrated mutterings, enraged outbursts, and the sound of furniture being dragged noisily across the floor. The next morning, they flew to Atlanta, where the cheerful man at the check-in desk gave them some unsettling news. "A lot of trouble with wolves down in Georgia," he mentioned casually, before adding that record-breaking cold was heading their way. To Katz specifically, he gave a final wink. "You watch out for those wolves, son, because between you and me, you look like pretty good eating." Their journey officially began at Amicalola Falls State Park, the approach to Springer Mountain, the southern terminus of the trail. Every year, roughly 2,000 hikers set off from this exact spot, most intending to walk all the way to Maine. No more than 10% actually make it. A quarter don't even make it out of the first state. The next morning, March 9, 1996, under a gorgeous blue sky but with a startlingly bitter wind, they stepped onto the path. The reality of their undertaking hit them like a physical blow. The first day was absolute hell. Bryson was hopelessly out of shape, and his pack felt impossibly heavy. Every single step was a struggle up an endless series of steep hills. The truly dispiriting thing about climbing a hill, he discovered, is that you can never actually see the top. Each time you think you've finally reached the crest, you discover there's more hill beyond, and even more beyond that, until it seems genuinely impossible any hill could be this long. Katz was falling behind almost immediately, panting heavily, sweating profusely, and talking to himself in a loud, bitter voice. Bryson pushed on alone, lost in his own miserable world of weariness and woe. Late in the afternoon, he finally reached the summit of Springer Mountain. He waited patiently for Katz. And waited. After 45 increasingly worried minutes, he went back to find him. He found Katz stumbling toward him, wild-haired and teetering near hysteria. In a spectacular fit of rage at the trail's difficulty, he had thrown numerous items from his pack over a cliff. The pepperoni, the rice, the brown sugar, the Spam, all gone, tumbling down the mountainside. He was, as Bryson perfectly put it, cataleptic with displeasure, feeling deeply betrayed by the trail. It wasn't remotely what he'd expected. That night at the first shelter, surrounded by other, significantly lankier hikers, Katz simply crawled into his tent and went straight to sleep without dinner. In the morning, however, he was surprisingly apologetic. "Was I, would you say, a complete asshole last night?" he asked quietly. He was making peace-offering coffee, filtered ingeniously through toilet paper, because he'd thrown the actual coffee filters over the cliff as well. It was then they took proper inventory of their remaining food. It was, Bryson notes dryly, startlingly austere. Some noodles, raisins, coffee, salt, candy bars, and toilet paper. That was pretty much it. Katz had flung the cheese. Bryson, for his part, had conveniently forgotten all the oatmeal and every single one of the Little Debbie cakes back in New Hampshire. "You left the Little Debbies?" Katz asked, his face a portrait of utter disbelief. "All of them?" His promised good mood was already being severely tested. So they walked on, deeper into the vast, featureless nowhere of the American woods. For Bryson, the woods were genuinely spooky. They make you feel small, confused, and vulnerable. You can't shake the unsettling feeling that you're being constantly watched. Even famously tough men like Daniel Boone describe parts of these mountains as so wild and horrid that it is impossible to behold them without terror. Their days quickly fell into a simple routine: rise at dawn, make coffee, eat a modest handful of raisins, and walk. They seldom walked together, since their paces didn't naturally match, but Bryson would wait every few hours to make sure Katz was still coming. They were part of a loose, shifting affiliation of fellow hikers, all heading steadily north, all sharing the same discomforts and the same wonderfully eccentric impulse to walk to Maine. Then, on the fourth evening, they made a friend, or rather, a friend aggressively made them. A plumpish young woman from Florida named Mary Ellen cheerfully announced she would camp with them. Mary Ellen, as Katz would later describe her in a special tone of horrified awe, was a piece of work. She talked absolutely nonstop, had a firm opinion on everything, and was a self-proclaimed expert on all of their many mistakes. "Noodles?" she said critically, peering into their bowls. "Big mistake. Noodles have got like no energy whatsoever." She criticized Bryson's tent, his boots, and their slow pace. "You guys must be like really out of shape," she declared bluntly, after they'd hiked only 8 miles. "I did 14 too." When Bryson politely pointed out she'd started from the same place as them, and that the actual distance was only 8.4 miles, she just shook her head stubbornly. 14 too. Her most memorable moment of unsolicited wisdom was directed squarely at Katz. "You know what your problem is?" she announced. "Pardon my French, but you're too fat. You should have lost weight before you came out here." Katz, to his immense credit, said absolutely nothing. They couldn't shake her. She was majestically inexperienced and clearly terrified to be on her own. So they became an unlikely trio, trudging wearily up and over Blood Mountain, the highest peak in Georgia, their spirits lifted by one glorious thought: Neal's Gap. At Neal's Gap was a place called the Wallacey Ye Inn, a store where you could actually buy sandwiches and ice cream. After 5 long days in the woods, arriving at a paved highway and walking through an actual door felt genuinely novel and exciting. The central feature of life on the trail, Bryson realized, is absolute deprivation. It removes you so thoroughly from everyday convenience that the most ordinary things, a cold can of pop, a slice of white bread, fill you with a sense of wonder that borders on the orgasmic. They bought glorious egg salad sandwiches, took hot showers, and did laundry. For the first time, Bryson felt he genuinely wanted to keep going. He was feeling fit, he was clean, and best of all, they'd finally lost Mary Ellen. They hiked on to a perfect meadow for camping and celebrated with a surprise Bryson had secretly bought: Hostess cupcakes. As they were lying there, perfectly content, Katz let out a low, pained groan. Mary Ellen was striding purposefully down the trail toward them, from completely the wrong direction. "I wondered where you guys had got to," she scolded, before immediately spotting the last cupcake. "Well, I don't mind if I do," she said breezily, and consumed it in 2 quick bites. It would be several long days before Katz smiled again. They finally ditched her for good by hiking an ambitious 14 miles in one determined day to Dick's Creek Gap, where they hitched a ride into the town of Hiawassee. Their ride was a story in itself. A baby blue Pontiac Trans Am, driven by a very happy, very drunk young couple who were getting married the next day. The driver, Darren, drove at absolutely terrifying speeds while his fiancée, Donna, celebrated by periodically lunging at him romantically, causing the car to swerve excitingly into oncoming traffic. In Hiawassee, they ate a massive meal at the Georgia Mountain Restaurant, highlighted by a vast canary yellow wedge of lemon pie for Bryson. But just as he was about to dig in, Katz grew unexpectedly serious. He felt bad. They'd ditched Mary Ellen, leaving her completely alone in the woods. As Bryson considered this uncomfortable truth, realizing with a horrible, seeping awareness that Katz was absolutely right, his appetite vanished completely. He pushed the beautiful pie away. Katz leaned closer and said, in a completely different tone of voice, "If you're not going to eat that pie, can I have it?" The next day on the trail, they met a hiker coming the opposite direction, who'd stayed in a shelter with Mary Ellen the night before. "She a friend of yours?" he asked dubiously. They quickly denied it. The hiker then told them exactly what she'd said about them. She'd called them a couple of overweight wimps who didn't know the first thing about hiking, and said she was tired of carrying them. "In fact," he added helpfully, "actually, I think she called you pussies." "She called us pussies," Katz said, utterly scandalized. "Now I will kill her." Bryson's only response was to tell Katz firmly, "Don't you ever, ever spoil a piece of pie for me again." Their journey continued, but the pivotal moment, the one that would change absolutely everything, happened in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. After a miserable, rain-soaked, and hopelessly crowded slog through the Great Smoky Mountains, they escaped to the town for a much-needed break. Gatlinburg is a tourist town, a shocking assault on the system with its greasy food, tacky gift shops, and waddling crowds. In an outfitter's shop, Bryson spotted a map of the entire Appalachian Trail pinned prominently to a wall. It was roughly 4 feet high. He looked closer, and his jaw literally dropped. Of the 4 feet of trail map stretching before him, all their effort, all the grueling miles, all the sweat and misery, added up to the bottom 2 measly inches. He went and got Katz immediately. "We've done nothing," Katz breathed, his face completely drained of expression. It was painfully obvious. They were never, ever going to walk to Maine. And, in a weird way, it was genuinely liberating. If they couldn't possibly walk the whole trail, then they simply didn't have to. The mad, pointless business of stepping over every single inch of ground was suddenly gone. They could actually enjoy themselves. They decided right then and there to skip a huge chunk of the trail. They rented a car and drove 500 miles north to Virginia, to the beautiful Shenandoah National Park. Shenandoah was absolutely lovely. The terrain was noticeably gentler. Spring was blooming in the air, and wildlife was everywhere. Best of all, because the trail often parallels the scenic Skyline Drive, there were actual restaurants. It was completely against the purist spirit of the AT, but they happily stopped for cheeseburgers and ice-cold Cokes. It was here, in beautiful Shenandoah, that Bryson had his own absolutely terrifying night with the bears, or something. One night, a sound jolted him awake from deep sleep, the distinct sound of breaking branches and a large, irritable snuffling. "Bear!" He sat bolt upright, heart hammering wildly. He whispered urgently to Katz, who was characteristically calm. "Everything sounds big in the woods," Katz mumbled sleepily. Bryson crept nervously out of his tent and saw two shining eyes staring directly back at him from the darkness. When he desperately asked Katz if he had anything sharp, Katz helpfully offered his nail clippers. Then, a second pair of eyes appeared ominously. Just as his flashlight batteries died, Katz announced calmly, "Well, I'm going to sleep," and promptly did exactly that. Bryson spent the entire night gripping a walking stick tightly, ready for an attack that never actually came. He never discovered what the creatures actually were, but he knew with absolute certainty he would never again sleep in the woods with a light heart. After Shenandoah, their first leg of the journey came to an end. They'd hiked 500 solid miles. They were, they proudly declared, mountain men. They'd shit in the woods and slept with bears. Katz went back to Des Moines, promising faithfully to return in August for the final, most difficult section, the legendary 100-mile wilderness in Maine. Bryson tried hiking alone for a while, but it honestly wasn't the same. He felt a helpless and dispiriting pointlessness in it. He'd lost his momentum, his deep connectedness to the trail. He genuinely missed Katz. But in August, as faithfully promised, Katz returned. They would tackle the infamous 100-mile wilderness, a 99.7-mile stretch of boreal forest with absolutely no stores, no houses, and no paved roads whatsoever. It's the remotest section of the entire AT. If something goes seriously wrong, you're completely on your own. Katz arrived with a brilliant and terrible idea. To save precious weight, he suggested enthusiastically that they abandon their heavy backpacks and instead use Des Moines Register newspaper delivery bags. "When was the last time you saw a paperboy with a hernia?" he asked, completely serious. Bryson tactfully talked him out of the newspaper bags, but they did agree to go ultralight, leaving the stove and cookpots behind, and subsisting entirely on cold food, like Slim Jims and Snickers. Maine was an absolute shock to the system. The state was suffering through a killer heat wave, and the terrain was brutally unforgiving. The trail in Maine, Bryson learned painfully, has a hale devotion to seeking out the rockiest climbs and most forbidding slopes. It was the hardest hiking they'd ever attempted. Worse still, Katz was basically starting from scratch physically, and his first day back was a sweaty, painful ordeal. On the second day, they came to a murky lagoon that they had no choice but to ford. Both of them slipped on submerged logs and plunged dramatically into the chest-deep water, their packs dragging them down like anchors. Soaked and utterly exhausted, they sat dripping on the far bank when two young, impossibly fit hikers strode confidently past. One of them looked at their miserable state and said cheerfully, "This, your first time hiking up here? Well, I don't want to discourage you, but mister, you've only just started to get wet." And then, in the town of Monson, on the very eve of entering the 100-mile wilderness proper, came the next crisis. At dinner, in their cozy guest house, Katz seemed strangely hyper. almost manic. In the grocery store later, he suddenly begged Bryson to buy him a six-pack of beer. It turned out he'd started drinking again back in Des Moines. Bryson, furious and feeling deeply betrayed, refused flatly. "Then fuck you," Katz said bluntly, and walked out. They entered the wilderness the next morning in a heavy, angry silence. The trail was absolutely hellish. It was brutally hot, and the climbs were near perpendicular walls of solid rock. They quickly ran dangerously low on water. The day dissolved into a blur of exhausting effort and burning thirst. That night, camped wearily by a stream, they were too utterly tired to speak. The next morning, on the windswept summit of Barren Mountain, Katz finally broke the suffocating silence. He apologized sincerely. "There's just this kind of hole in my life, where drinking used to be," he explained, his voice quiet and genuinely humble. He talked about the profound loneliness of sobriety, of going home to a frozen TV dinner while his coworkers headed cheerfully to a tavern. He didn't want a lecture. He just wanted his friend to genuinely understand. It was a moment of profound, painful honesty. The truce was quietly made. But then, complete disaster. Bryson went ahead to a pond to filter water, telling Katz firmly he would wait for him. But Katz never arrived. Bryson waited anxiously, then went back. He wasn't on the mountaintop where they'd talked. He was simply gone. Bryson was consumed with terrible worry. Katz was alone, with no map and no water, in the middle of the most remote wilderness on the entire trail. He might have fallen badly. He might have gotten desperately thirsty and tried to find a lake cross-country, an absolutely fatal mistake in these vast, trackless woods. Bryson spent the night completely alone, sick with mounting dread. The next morning he pushed on desperately, hoping against hope to find him. 4 agonizing hours later, he found Katz sitting dejectedly on a rock by the trail, scratched up and muddy, but miraculously alive. He had, in fact, gotten hopelessly lost. Thirsty and confused, he'd plunged impulsively into the woods, trying to reach a lake he'd seen from the mountain. He quickly became totally, utterly lost. "It's weird," he said quietly. "There's nothing to pay attention to out there. It's just one big, endless woods." Just when he was about to give up completely and die, by a pure, inexplicable miracle, he stumbled back onto the AT. He was exhausted, scared, and completely out of his depth. "You want to go home?" Bryson asked him gently. "Yeah," Katz said simply. "I do." "Me too." And that was it. They hiked to a dirt logging road, hitched a ride in the back of a speeding pickup truck with some loggers, and just like that, their great adventure was suddenly over. They never saw Mount Katahdin. They ended up in a small town called Milo, at a cozy boarding house run by a kindly woman named Mrs. Bishop. As they walked through the peaceful town that evening, Katz asked thoughtfully if Bryson felt bad about quitting. Bryson honestly didn't know. His feelings were a complicated mess of contradictions. He was utterly weary of the trail, but still, somehow in its thrall. He desperately wanted to quit and wanted to do it forever. Then Katz said something that put it all into perfect perspective. "Anyway, we did it," he said firmly. "As far as I'm concerned, I hiked the Appalachian Trail. I hiked it in snow, and I hiked it in heat. I hiked it in the south, and I hiked it in the north. I hiked it till my feet bled. I hiked the Appalachian Trail. Bryson." "We missed out a lot of it, you know," Bryson replied honestly. "Details," Katz sniffed dismissively. And in that moment, Bryson realized he was absolutely right. They'd tried. And that was genuinely enough. Bryson eventually calculated that he'd walked 870 miles, not even half of the trail's total length, and yet the number honestly didn't matter. He'd learned to sleep peacefully beneath the stars. He'd become genuinely fit. He'd gained a profound respect for nature. And he understood the colossal scale of the world in a way he never had before. He'd strengthened a friendship. He'd come home. They might not have walked all 200 miles, but they'd tried their absolute best. They hiked the Appalachian Trail. So what do we actually take away from a story like this? It's easy to look at Bill Bryson's journey and immediately see it as a failure. He didn't reach his stated goal. He didn't walk every single mile. He and Katz skipped a massive section in the middle and didn't even finish the final leg. By the strict, technical definition of a thru-hike, they absolutely failed. But I think that's actually the most powerful lesson of this entire book. It completely redefines what it means to succeed. In a world that's so often obsessed with outcomes, with finishing the race, with getting the grade, with reaching the summit, Bryson's story reminds us that there's a fundamentally different kind of victory. It's the victory of the honest attempt. It's the courage to start something you know is ridiculously hard, something you're genuinely not prepared for, and to see where it takes you. Think about it seriously. Bryson wasn't some elite athlete. He was a middle-aged writer who genuinely liked comfortable chairs. And Katz was in a league entirely of his own. They were magnificently, beautifully, humanly unprepared. And yet they went anyway. They faced the bitter cold, the oppressive heat, the endless rain, the sticky mud, the fears both real and wildly imagined. They endured Mary Ellen. They carried impossibly heavy packs up seemingly impossible hills. They got hopelessly lost, and in the end, they walked 870 miles. That's the distance from New York City to Chicago. That's not a failure. That's a genuine achievement. This book is also a powerful meditation on friendship. The relationship between Bryson and Katz is one of the most honest and hilarious portrayals of male friendship I've ever encountered. They bicker constantly. They complain endlessly. They drive each other absolutely crazy. Katz throws away crucial supplies. Bryson gets lost in his own contemplative thoughts. But when it genuinely matters, they're there for each other. When Katz is near total collapse on that brutal first day, Bryson goes back for him. When Katz is lost somewhere in the Maine wilderness, Bryson's only thought is finding him. And when Bryson is terrified of a bear lurking in the dark, Katz is there. Well, he's there sleeping peacefully, but his mere presence is a genuine comfort nonetheless. Theirs is a friendship forged not in grand gestures, but in shared misery and small, often unspoken acts of quiet loyalty. Finally, A Walk in the Woods is a genuine love letter to a forgotten America. Through Bryson's observant eyes, we see the immense, silent, and deeply beautiful wilderness that still exists just beyond our highways. He reminds us powerfully that this beauty is fragile, constantly threatened by pollution, neglect, and our own collective indifference. He shows us that you don't have to travel to the Amazon or the Himalayas to find true wilderness. It's right here. The Appalachian Trail is a genuine national treasure, maintained almost entirely by volunteers, a free and open path for anyone with the simple will to walk it. So what can you actually do with these lessons? First, find your own personal Appalachian Trail. It doesn't have to be a 2,000-mile hike. It can be anything that feels genuinely daunting, anything that sits just outside your current comfort zone. The point isn't to conquer it completely. The point is to try honestly. The point is to see how far you can actually go. Second, learn to appreciate the small victories. Bryson's journey teaches us to find what he beautifully calls low-level ecstasy, the profound joy of a cold drink after a long, hot day, the sweet relief of taking off a heavy pack, the simple comfort of a dry pair of socks. Our lives are genuinely filled with these small moments of grace, if only we take the time to notice them. And finally, go for a walk. You don't have to climb a mountain. Just find a local park, a trail, even a quiet street in your neighborhood. Leave the phone behind. Look up. Notice the trees, the sky, the way the light falls beautifully. Understand that you're a part of this vast, incredible world. As Bryson discovered firsthand, you don't have to walk hundreds of miles to feel the amazing, complex delicacy of the woods. But believe him, it genuinely helps. That was the story of A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. We've journeyed through the highs and the lows together today, but I'll be completely honest with you. A summary can only show you the map. The real territory, the real adventure, happens when you read the book for yourself. It's in the quiet moments, when Bryson's humor makes you laugh out loud, or a description of a sunset genuinely takes your breath away. This summary is just a signpost, meant to help you decide if this is a path worth walking. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity, I genuinely urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning. It's an experience that can genuinely change the way you see yourself, your country, and the woods just beyond the edge of town. A link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep growing and walking together.